Sitting in the living room bathed in autumn sunlight, I was leafing through an old photo album. My heart clenched as I gazed at the smiling face of my grandson, Michael. My name is Emily Johnson. Even now, in my 60s, I'm still living quietly in this small town called Maple Grove. A year ago, when 5-year-old Michael passed away in an accident, it felt like all the color drained from my life. My daughter Sarah and her husband John were plunged into deep sorrow, and since then, I've felt like there's been a crack in our family bonds. Last month, I received a call from Sarah. She told me that her husband John had been transferred overseas for work. "We want to move forward in a new environment," Sarah said, but there was no strength in her voice. Despite my mixed feelings, I accepted their decision. However, the question of what to do with their house after they left was an issue. In the end, we decided to demolish the old house and clear the land. Letting go of that house filled with memories was painful, but I suppose that's just part of life. As the demolition day approached, my heart grew heavier. On the morning the demolition was set to begin, I woke up early. Unable to eat breakfast, I left the house with an unsettled feeling. As I drove, I remembered how many times I had driven down this road with Michael. When I arrived at Sarah's house, the workers were already gathered. They greeted me politely when they noticed me. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson. If there's anything we can help you with today, please don't hesitate to ask," said a man who seemed to be the leader. "Thank you. But I'm fine. I just want to look around inside for a bit," I replied. As I entered the house, a familiar scent hit my nose. Michael's drawings were still taped to the walls. In the kitchen, memories of baking cookies with Sarah came flooding back. In the corner of the living room, the bookshelf John had assembled still stood quietly. As I climbed the stairs and entered Michael's room, tears welled up in my eyes. His toys and clothes were still there, just as if he might return at any moment. On the bed lay the blanket I had knitted for him, neatly folded. Looking out the window, I saw the swing in the garden. I vividly remembered, as if it were yesterday, Michael laughing and shouting, "Higher," as he swung. Forgetting the passage of time, I slowly walked through the house. Every room was filled with memories. The happy days we spent in this house, and sometimes painful events, were all part of our lives. The sound of engines outside brought me back to reality. The workers must be starting preparations for the demolition. Taking a deep breath, I headed for the front door. As I stepped outside, the workers were looking at me with concern. "Are you all right?" the leader asked. I managed a smile and replied, "Yes, I'm fine. Let's begin." And so, with the sound of heavy machinery, the demolition of the house filled with our family memories began, quietly but surely. As the demolition progressed, I stood in the garden, watching the work. As the autumn breeze caressed my cheeks, memories of my family flashed through my mind. With each sound of the heavy machinery, I felt a tightening in my chest. Suddenly, the work came to a halt. The leader approached me. "Mrs. Johnson, we'd like to check the basement. Do you have the key?" I tilted my head in confusion. Basement? This house doesn't have a basement. The leader looked perplexed. But there's a basement marked on the blueprints. Driven by curiosity, we entered the house. When we removed an old rug in the corner of the living room, there was indeed something that looked like a door. A rusty latch, showing no signs of recent use, caught my eye. I had no idea this was here, I murmured. As the workers tried to open the door, we heard a faint sound. We held our breath and listened. And then we heard it again. Help, somebody, help. A weak but clear voice. My heart began to race. The voice sounded like Michael. I found myself saying out loud. The workers hurriedly tried to open the door, but years of rust made it difficult to move. While the leader ran to get tools, I pressed my ear against the door. Michael? Is that you? It's Grandma. There was no response, but I could hear faint noises. My hands were shaking, and cold sweat beaded on my forehead. When the door finally opened, a damp smell wafted out. The beam of a flashlight illuminated a dark staircase, and we slowly descended. The basement was larger than expected, with a small room at the far end. That door too was tightly shut. Michael? Are you in here? A weak reply came. Grandma. The moment I heard that voice, tears streamed from my eyes. As the workers opened the door, a small figure was visible in the dim corner of the room. The face illuminated by the flashlight was undoubtedly my grandson, Michael. Though emaciated and pale, he was unmistakably alive. Michael. I rushed over and held him tightly. Michael clung to me with his weak arms. Grandma. I was so scared. His trembling voice nearly tore my heart apart. Joy, anger, relief, and anxiety, a flood of emotions washed over me. It's okay now. Grandma's here with you. As I cradled Michael, I steeled my resolve. To uncover the truth and protect Michael, that was the only thing I could do now. When I brought Michael above ground, the autumn sunlight illuminated his pale face. I quickly fetched a blanket to wrap around him and asked one of the workers to call an ambulance. It's all right now, Michael. You're safe, I whispered as I held him close. Michael nodded weakly, still trembling in my arms. His body was emaciated, his hair unkempt, and dark circles had formed under his eyes. While waiting for the ambulance to arrive, I also contacted the police. After briefly explaining the situation, they promised to dispatch officers immediately. As the paramedics were performing an initial assessment on Michael, I dialed Sarah's number with shaking hands. After several rings, Sarah's voice came through. Mom? What's wrong? Taking a deep breath, I began to speak. Sarah, listen. We've found Michael. I heard Sarah gasp on the other end of the line. What did you say? It's Michael. He's alive. We found him in the basement of your house. After a long silence, Sarah broke down in tears. No, that can't be true. It is. The ambulance is here now. And the police. Sarah's sobs intensified, and the call disconnected. A few minutes later, I received a call from John. His voice sounded calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension. "Emily, is what we just heard true?" "Yes, it is. You two need to come back immediately." John heaved a deep sigh and said, "I understand. We'll make arrangements right away," before hanging up. Michael was taken to the hospital by ambulance, and I accompanied him. The examination results showed that, fortunately, there were no major health issues, but he was suffering from long-term malnutrition and mild dehydration. As the initial police questioning began, Michael started to speak in a trembling voice. "Dad and Mom, they hid me. They said, 'Stay here for a while.'" I gasped. It was hard to believe what I was hearing. The next day, after Michael's condition had stabilized, a more detailed interview was conducted. I was allowed to be present. Michael began to speak slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. "That day, Dad and Mom put me in the car. They said it was a secret adventure, but they took me to the basement of the house." According to his account, Sarah and John had told him to wait here for a while, and left him with food and water. At first, they said they would be back in a few days, but as time passed, their visits became less frequent. The police began investigating Sarah and John's financial records. And a shocking fact came to light. The two of them were deeply in debt and struggling to repay it. Furthermore, Michael had a high-value life insurance policy. The police speculated that Sarah and John had planned to fake Michael's accidental death to fraudulently claim the insurance money. Then, they likely planned to flee abroad under the guise of an overseas job transfer after receiving the insurance payout. As these facts came to light, anger and sadness swirled within me. I couldn't believe that my own daughter would do something so cruel to her sweet child. Why would they do such a thing? I muttered. The police intensified their investigation, and arrest warrants were issued for Sarah and John. Arrangements were made to apprehend them at the airport upon their arrival. My heart was in turmoil over this series of events. Love for my daughter and anger at her actions. Joy at getting my grandson back and heartache over the terror he had experienced. These complex emotions left me sleepless for days. One thing was clear, though. My mission now was to protect Michael and provide him with a safe, loving environment. As Michael was recovering in the hospital, the day of Sarah and John's emergency return approached. My heart was filled with conflicting emotions. The desire to see my daughter battled with anger at her actions. As expected, Sarah and John were taken into custody by the police upon their arrival at the airport. They didn't seem surprised and quietly complied. A few days later, after police interrogations, I was permitted to meet with Sarah and John. In a hospital room, I spent a long time preparing myself emotionally. The door opened, and the two of them entered. Sarah's eyes were red as if she had been crying, and John looked exhausted. "Mom," Sarah called out in a small voice. I stared back at her. "Why? This single word was all I could force out of my mouth. Sarah broke down crying and collapsed to the floor. John placed a hand on her shoulder, but he was trembling too. "We're so sorry, truly sorry." John repeatedly apologized. Unable to contain my emotions, I raised my voice. "Sorry. You put your son, my grandson, through such an ordeal, and you think sorry is enough?" Sarah raised her face and began to speak through her tears. We were hounded by debt. We lost our minds. We thought Michael's insurance money would solve everything. For money. You sacrificed your own child. My voice shook with anger. John cut in. At first, we really meant it to be just for a few days. But once we told the lie, we couldn't turn back. I let out a deep sigh. Do you have any idea how much fear and pain you've caused Michael? At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and a nurse brought Michael in. The atmosphere in the room instantly froze. When Michael saw his parents, his body stiffened. Sarah and John tried to approach their son, but Michael hid behind me. "Michael. I'm so sorry," Sarah said, crying. Michael remained silent, clinging to me. Feeling his small body tremble, I embraced him protectively. John knelt down, lowering himself to Michael's eye level. "Son, Dad, and Mom made a terrible mistake. We're so sorry for hurting you." Michael finally looked up and said in a shaky voice, Don't leave me again." At those words, everyone in the room broke into tears. Sarah and John bowed deeply, acknowledging their crime and stating they were prepared to accept any punishment. At this moment, while the family bonds weren't completely repaired, it felt like a small step towards healing had been taken. Sarah and John's trial shocked the local community. They were charged with child abuse and insurance fraud, and ultimately received prison sentences. During the trial, the details of their plan were revealed. "We intended to rescue Michael before the house was demolished," Sarah testified tearfully on the stand. "But we had to leave the country earlier than planned to escape from debt collectors." John added, "We thought no one knew about the basement. We planned to come back before the demolition, but..." Their words left the courtroom silent. The foolishness of their plan and their sense of regret were painfully clear. After the sentencing, I applied for custody of Michael. The court quickly approved, and Michael was officially placed under my care. As our new life began, Michael slowly started to regain his smile. With the support of a psychotherapist, he's facing and trying to overcome his past trauma. One evening, while having a barbecue in the backyard with Michael, he suddenly hugged me. "Grandma, thank you," he whispered. I hugged him back tightly. "Michael, having you here makes Grandma so happy." At that moment, tears welled up in both our eyes. They weren't tears of sadness, but of new hope and joy. Sarah and John are participating in rehabilitation programs in prison, deeply reflecting on their actions. During visits, they repeatedly offered heartfelt apologies to Michael. While Michael isn't able to fully forgive them yet, he's slowly beginning to show the courage to face his parents. Our family was hurt and nearly broken. But through this experience, we learned the true importance of family bonds. Now, we're healing our wounds and exploring a new form of family. Epilogue. 5 years later, Michael has grown into a bright 10-year-old boy. Sarah and John have been released on parole and are working towards reintegrating into society. We regularly attend family counseling, slowly rebuilding our bonds. The house that was supposed to be demolished has now been reborn as a community shelter. It serves a new purpose as a place to support children in difficult situations. Michael sometimes volunteers at the shelter. His kindness and strength give hope to many people. Our story began in despair. But now, it has become a story of hope and rebirth. Life may present unexpected challenges, but I believe that with love and courage,